At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. After all, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Larissa. Let's begin. The tension was thick enough to cut as the Galactic Council convened in an improvised meeting hall for a final attempt at mediating the looming war between humanity and the Kronak. Every species watched in silence as the two delegations ascended their respective elevated platforms, each presenting the typical representatives of their kind, except for a single blonde human woman standing quietly at the back, an earpiece in place, whom everyone immediately assumed was merely a translator. The improvised hall had been constructed specifically for this occasion on the neutral planet of Tertius 1, a world claimed by no species and monitored by the Galactic Federation as sacred ground for diplomacy. The dome stretched impossibly high above them, its translucent ceiling revealing the swirling purple and orange clouds of Tertius 1's turbulent atmosphere. Along the curved walls, observation galleries rose in tiers, packed with representatives from hundreds of species, all craning forward to witness what many believed would be the final opportunity to prevent a catastrophic war. Every single bystander diplomat, whether they possessed traditional eyes, compound visual organs, electromagnetic sensors, or echolocation membranes, focused their full attention on the center of the dome. Even the massive Gorund representatives, who typically showed little interest in what they considered small species conflicts, watched with uncharacteristic intensity from their reinforced platforms. The moment arrived. The main mediator's floating disc began to rise from the floor, a platform of silver metal at the center of the dome. It ascended smoothly, almost reverently, climbing through the charged air. Every eye tracked its progress as it rose higher, passing the lower observation galleries, continuing upward past the middle tiers. The disc slowed as it approached the center point of the dome, then stopped with absolute finality, positioned not a single centimeter higher or lower than either the Kronak platform or the human delegation platform. Standing on the disc was Anor, a Botier whose appearance never failed to draw attention. The Botier were among the most enigmatic species of the Federation, and Anor exemplified why. Their face, if it could be called that, was completely obscured by thick white tentacles that grew from where a humanoid might have a scalp, cascading down to cover every facial feature. The tentacles were in constant subtle motion, intertwining and separating like living curtains. No one in the assembled crowd could claim to have seen a Botier's full face. Their features remained one of the galaxy's persistent mysteries. On rare occasions, when the tentacles shifted just so, observers might catch the briefest glimpse of ocean blue eyes beneath the tangled appendages. Eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and sorrow that transcended species barriers. Anor raised what might have been arms, though with the flowing robes that covered their body, it was hard to distinguish specific limbs. And the dome's acoustics carried his voice to every corner of the massive space. The translation nodes embedded throughout the hall activated, converting Anor's words into the native languages of every species present. Honored delegates, observers, and representatives of the Galactic Federation, Anor began, his voice carrying a gentle quality that somehow transcended the mechanical translations. We are gathered here today in what may be our final opportunity to forge peace between the two most formidable, most militarized species our galaxy has known. The Kronak and humanity have brought us to the precipice of a conflict that would surely consume worlds, devastate populations, and scar our collective civilization for generations to come. The tentacles covering Anor's face shifted, and for just a moment, a sliver of that oceanic blue eye was visible, seeming to look at each delegate individually, despite the physical impossibility. Every sapient being present in this hall today carries with them the sincere wishes of trillions, the desperate hope that words spoken here might accomplish what weapons cannot. That reason might prevail where force would only bring ruin. We stand not as individual species, but as a collective of civilizations who have learned, often through terrible cost, that cooperation yields what conquest destroys. Anor paused, allowing the weight of their words to settle over the assembly. The silence was profound. By random selection, determined by neutral algorithm and witnessed by representatives of 15 species, the Kronak delegation will speak first today. They will have 30 standard minutes to present their position. Immediately following, humanity will receive an identical amount of time to respond. Let us proceed with the hope that both sides come to this negotiation with open minds and genuine desire for solution. The announcement sparked immediate reaction throughout the observation galleries. The Sithral delegation, serpentine beings known for their diplomatic expertise, coiled in agitated patterns as they whispered among themselves. Even the usually stoic Minari, beings of living stone who measured time in centuries rather than minutes, showed signs of unease as their surfaces trembled.
The Kronak speaking first,
one delegate hissed to another, the translation node picking up the comment.
After their recent military posturing.
Random selection, they said,
came the skeptical reply.
But is anything truly random when war looms?
The murmuring grew a susurrus of concern and speculation that filled the dome like rising water. Species that had not communicated directly in decades found themselves exchanging worried glances and hurried consultations. But the conversations died down almost instantly as movement caught every observer's attention. A small microphone drone, no larger than a human fist, detached itself from its charging station and flew toward the Kronak platform. These drones were marvels of Federation technology, equipped with translation software that could simultaneously broadcast in over 3,000 languages and communication formats. The drone positioned itself at exactly the height of the speaker's mouth and extended a small glowing sphere that would capture every nuance of speech. The drone settled into position before Bryozip, the Kronak's most recognizable ambassador, and the assembly fell into an expectant silence. Bryozip stepped forward to meet the microphone drone, and as he did, the lighting systems automatically adjusted to illuminate him, making him the focal point of thousands of eyes. He was the epitome of what the Kronak considered physical perfection, a male specimen who exemplified the martial culture of his species. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his body was a study in muscle and predatory intent. His scaled skin was pristine and deep emerald and obsidian, creating an almost hypnotic effect as he moved. The scales weren't uniform. They varied in size and arrangement, creating natural armor plating that was thickest across his chest, shoulders, and back. Bryozip reached up and adjusted the microphone drone. He let the silence stretch for a moment, understanding the power of theatrical timing. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep.
I must begin,
he said,
by addressing not the humans, but our esteemed mediator Anor, and all of you who traveled across the stars to waste your time on this neutral rock.
A collective intake of breath rippled through the galleries. This wasn't how diplomatic proceedings typically began. Delegates exchanged shocked glances, and the Sithral ambassador's body coiled so tightly it formed almost a complete circle.
Yes, waste your time,
Bryozip continued, his tone casual, conversational.
That's what this is, a waste, a performance, a theater where we all pretend that words matter, that carefully constructed sentences and diplomatic niceties can somehow alter the fundamental realities of power and survival.
He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the observation galleries, making sure his words reached every corner of the dome.
Do you know what the humans understand, unlike the rest of you?
He paused, letting the question hang in the air.
They understand that we're already at war. Not the war of words and negotiations, but real war. The kind where one species proves its right to exist by demonstrating that the other species cannot stop them. They came here today knowing this truth, while the rest of you cling to your precious illusions of galactic harmony.
Bryozip stopped speaking abruptly, even though the chronometer displayed prominently at the top of the dome showed he had used less than 3 minutes of his allotted 30. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. He simply stood there, his brown eyes fixed on Anor, waiting. The mediator's tentacles shifted in what might have been confusion or distress. It was impossible to tell with the Botier. From every observation gallery, eyes focused on Anor with something approaching sympathy, even pity. The mediator hadn't asked for this role, hadn't volunteered to be the target of Bryozip's contempt. Anor was simply doing a job, representing the collective interest of all Federation species in preventing a catastrophic war. Being mocked for attempting to facilitate peace seemed not just rude, but cruel.
That is...
Anor began, his voice quieter than before, the melodic quality strained.
That is an unfortunate way of thinking, Ambassador Bryozip.
The response was mild and utterly inadequate to the provocation, but what else could Anor say? The Botier were peacekeepers, not warriors. Their entire philosophy centered on finding common ground, on the belief that all conflicts could be resolved through understanding and compromise. Bryozip laughed. It wasn't the polite chuckle of diplomatic humor or the nervous release of tension. It was genuine amusement, the laugh of someone who had just heard a child propose something adorably naive.
Unfortunate?
Bryozip repeated, still chuckling.
You see, Anor, this is exactly what I mean. You call it unfortunate, as if my thoughts are somehow defective, somehow wrong because they don't ally with your Federation's comfortable fictions. But here's the truth that makes your tentacles writhe in the cold light of day. All ways of thinking are exactly that, abstract ideas, concepts floating in the void of space, meaning nothing, changing nothing.
He took a step forward, his scaled hand gripping the edge of his platform, his posture aggressive.
At the end of the day, power speaks, power acts, power shapes reality, and words.
He made a dismissive gesture.
Words vanish in the wind. They evaporate like water on a hot stone. They leave no mark, change no borders, save no lives, and win no wars.
Finally, Bryozip's eyes moved away from Anor, sliding across the dome to fix on the human delegation. The shift in focus was predatory. Every being in the hall followed his gaze, and for the first time, the human delegation came under true scrutiny. All the other Kronak delegates on the platform moved closer to Bryozip in a coordinated motion, forming a tight unit behind him. It was a show of absolute unity, a physical demonstration that Bryozip spoke not just for himself, but for his entire species. Their scales created a wall of green and black, their collective bone protrusions forming a crown of deterrence.
Technical team,
Bryozip called out, his voice sharp and commanding. He wasn't speaking to the humans or to Anor, but to his own people stationed on the ground level below, amid the crowd of various species.
Project our peace proposal on the main screen. Let everyone see what real negotiation looks like.
The reaction from the crowd was immediate and visceral. The Kronak technical team was already moving, pulling out portable equipment, interfacing with the dome's massive display systems, but before they even began their work, the crowd had erupted in confused murmuring. Delegates who had been silent throughout Bryozip's provocations now turned to their neighbors, speaking rapidly in dozens of languages that created a babble of concern.
Peace proposal? Is he serious?
What could they possibly show? The audacity to call anything they're doing peace. The whispers grew louder, more agitated. On the ground, the Kronak technical team worked quickly. They were all soldiers. That much was clear from their bearing and the way they moved. They connected cables, interfaced with Federation systems, and ran security checks. The dome's main screen activated soon. It was enormous, covering a significant portion of the curved wall, designed to be visible from any angle in the observation galleries. At first, all it showed was noise and static, a chaotic swirl of pixels and interference that made several species recoil from the visual assault. The silence that fell over the assembly was different now. It wasn't the silence of expectation or diplomatic courtesy. It was the silence of held breath, of instinctive fear that something terrible was about to be revealed. Hey everyone, Larissa here, transmitting a quick reminder to like and subscribe for more HFY stories just like this one. All right, now let's reestablish the link and get back to the story. The technical team worked frantically to stabilize the connection, and then, suddenly, the image clarified. The screen showed hundreds, perhaps 1,000 humans on their knees. The clarity was terrible, revealing every detail in high definition. Some of the humans wore military uniforms, the kind of tactical gear that marked them as soldiers or security personnel. Others were clearly civilians, elderly individuals, young adults, and horrifyingly, some who looked barely old enough to be called teenagers. They were arranged in rough rows across what appeared to be an open field, the ground beneath them a green that suggested Earth-like vegetation. Around these kneeling humans stood hundreds of Kronak soldiers, their weapons raised, their postures aggressive and unmistakably threatening. This was no military standoff or prisoner exchange scenario. This was a hostage situation displayed for all the galaxy to see. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Species that rarely showed emotion now gasped or made their equivalents of shocked sounds. The Sithral uncoiled so rapidly that several nearly fell from their platforms. Even the Minari, beings who thought in geological time scales, emitted deep rumbling sounds that conveyed profound disturbance. On the screen, the Kronak soldiers were clearly making a spectacle of their captives' suffering. They grabbed humans by their hair, forced them into even more degraded positions, struck them with rifle butts when they didn't move quickly enough. One soldier held a young human woman by the neck, forcing her face toward the camera as if presenting a trophy. The woman's eyes were defiant despite her obvious terror, her lips moving in what might have been words of resistance or prayer. Some of the younger-looking humans were crying, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. An elderly man was bleeding from a cut above his eye. A woman in a torn military uniform held her arm at an odd angle, clearly injured but denied medical treatment. The Kronak guards moved among them, treating their captives with the kind of contempt usually reserved for vermin. Bryozip laughed again. The sound was worse now, knowing what they were all seeing on the screen. He turned away from the human delegation to face the display, as if admiring a work of art, then looked back at the humans, making sure they could see his expression.
Let me explain what you're seeing,
he said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher lecturing particularly slow students.
While the human delegation was preparing to come here, making their travel arrangements, writing their speeches about peace and cooperation, my people were preparing for something much more practical. We were preparing for war.
He gestured expansively at the screen.
What you're seeing is what was supposed to be humanity's third colony outside their home system. Notice I said, what was supposed to be. Past tense, because that moon with all its infrastructure, its agricultural facilities, its mining operations, its beautifully constructed habitats, all of it now belongs to the Kronak Empire. And those survivors you see kneeling in the dirt, there are hostages, property of the Kronak military.
The chronometer continued counting, but no one was paying attention to it anymore. Every eye was fixed either on Bryozip or on the horrifying images on the screen.
Our terms of peace are simple,
Bryozip continued, his voice taking on the cadence of formal negotiation, though the content was anything but formal.
Humanity will cede ownership of that moon to us, all infrastructure intact, all resources included. The humans have already done the hard work of making it habitable, of building the facilities we need. How thoughtful of them. In exchange, we'll return these survivors to Earth. Most of them, anyway. We might keep a few as insurance against future disagreements.
He paused, letting that threat sink in.
But this isn't just about one moon, one colony, one batch of hostages. This is about answering the question that's been whispered in every corner of the galaxy since humanity burst onto the interstellar stage. Which species is truly the strongest? Who would win if these two martial cultures went to war? Well, now you have your answer. We pulled off what everyone said was impossible. We struck a human colony in a surprise attack, penetrated their defenses, overwhelmed their military response, and took everything they had built. And you know the most telling part?
His smile widened, showing too many teeth.
They didn't resist effectively. Oh, they tried. The human soldiers fought bravely, stupidly, but bravely. But our planning, our technology, our warriors proved superior. The vaunted human military, the species that supposedly conquered half their own solar system before even achieving faster-than-light travel, couldn't stop us from taking what we wanted. What does that tell you about their true strength?
The collective attention of thousands of beings shifted from the screen to the human delegation. The movement was almost synchronized, as if controlled by a single mind. Everyone wanted to see how the humans were reacting to this revelation, this public humiliation, this ultimatum delivered with their own people suffering as visual emphasis. What they saw was strange. The human delegation stood in absolute silence. There were 6 of them visible on the platform, not counting the blonde woman who stood apart at the back. They wore formal diplomatic attire, similar across all of them. Dark suits with subtle earth blue accents that marked them as official representatives. Their faces showed nothing. No anger, no shock, no grief at seeing their fellow humans in such dire circumstances. They stood rigid, their posture military, watching the Kronak delegation with what appeared to be complete indifference. It was as if they were looking at weather data rather than witnessing the torture of their own species. This reaction, or lack thereof, struck the assembled observers as profoundly wrong. Species across the galaxies varied wildly in their emotional expressions and cultural norms, but the humans were known to be emotional beings. They felt grief, showed anger, expressed shock. Their literature, their entertainment, their entire culture export was built on emotional resonance. So why weren't they reacting now? A Sithral delegate leaned toward their Peltharian counterpart, speaking quietly but with clear agitation.
Look at them. They're not even pretending to be upset. Perhaps it's a cultural thing,
the Peltharian suggested, though their chimes conveyed deep uncertainty.
Some species become very stoic under stress. No, I've studied humans for decades. This isn't stoicism. I don't know what this is.
Even Anor, floating on their mediator's disk, seemed unsettled by the human delegation's response. The Botier's tentacles shifted in complex patterns, and fragments of those ocean blue eyes appeared more frequently, as if Anor was trying to see through the human's facade to understand what was happening beneath. On the screen, the suffering continued. A Kronak soldier kicked one of the human captives who had apparently not moved quickly enough. The human, a middle-aged man in civilian clothing, fell forward, catching himself with his hands before being yanked back up to his knees. Through it all, the human delegation on the platform didn't so much as flinch. Anor turned toward the human platform. The Botier was clearly struggling to maintain the facade of normal diplomatic proceeding when everything had just been shattered, but duty demanded they continue.
The Kronak delegation's time has concluded,
Anor announced, checking the chronometer more out of habit than necessity.
Under the rules of this mediation, it is now humanity's turn to speak. You have 30 standard minutes to present your response.
The entire assembly waited, breath held across hundreds of species and thousands of individuals. This was the moment that mattered. How would humanity respond to being so thoroughly outmaneuvered and humiliated on the galactic stage? The expected scene would have been the primary human ambassador stepping forward, probably a distinguished individual with white hair and decades of diplomatic experience, someone whose very presence conveyed gravitas and authority. Instead, the blonde woman who had been standing at the back of the platform, the one everyone had dismissed as merely a translator, took a step forward, then another. Her movements were direct and stiff. She was younger than anyone expected a speaker to be, perhaps in her early 30s by human standards, Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized sharp cheekbones and eyes of indeterminate gray-green color. The confusion in the dome was clear. Species turned to each other, seeking confirmation that they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. The woman reached the front of the platform and stood there, regarding the assembly with an expression that was impossible to read. She looked at the crowd in the observation galleries. She looked at the Kronak delegation. Her eyes swept across faces and sensory organs of dozens of species, and finally settled on the screen showing the captive humans. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. There was no attempt at diplomatic softness, no careful word choice, no practiced phrases designed to offend. No one while saying nothing. She spoke tersely, like someone reading a grocery list or reporting weather data.
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say here,
she began. I don't know what social rules apply, what protocols I should follow, what diplomatic niceties are expected in this situation. She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the air. The casual tone took on an edge. But it doesn't matter. The rules don't matter. The protocols don't matter, because I don't need many words for what comes next. Another pause, this one longer. The woman's eyes returned to the screen showing the human captives. For the briefest of moments, something crossed her face, a flicker of emotion that made her eyes seem slightly watery, as if she were on the verge of tears. But the moment passed so quickly that most observers wondered if they had imagined it. She raised her hand to the earpiece everyone had noticed earlier. The device they'd all assumed was for translation purposes. Her fingers pressed a small button on its side. Team Alpha, she said. You have permission to kill every single one of them. Silence. Complete, absolute, confused silence. The Kronak delegation looked bewildered. Bryozip's expression was priceless, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide, as if he'd just heard something in a language he didn't understand. The other Kronak representatives exchanged glances, their body language screaming uncertainty. The crowd in the observation galleries was even more confused. Species that specialized in military intelligence tried to parse what they'd just heard. What was Team Alpha? Permission for what? Get rid of whom? The statement was too simple, too direct, too cryptic all at once. Bryozip spoke without access to his microphone, his voice projecting across the space but not amplified.
What? What is the meaning of that?
His voice was smaller than before, uncertain in a way that seemed foreign to his entire demeanor.
What kind of response is that to our offer?
The human woman's gaze moved to him, just her eyes, not her whole head. The look she gave him was patient, almost pitying, the way someone might look at a child who had asked a question they'd already answered. She didn't speak. Instead, she looked pointedly at the screen showing the captive humans and their Kronak captors. Her meaning was clear. Watch. Just watch. Both the Kronak delegation and the crowd followed her gaze back to the screen. Some did so slowly, reluctantly. Others couldn't look away. The captive humans were still there, still kneeling, still surrounded by armed Kronak soldiers who seemed unaware that anything had changed. For a moment, nothing happened. The scene on the screen continued exactly as it had been, armed guards standing over prisoners, the green fields stretching out behind them, the sky visible at the edges of the frame. A few guards were laughing at something, one of them gesturing to another, and then one of them simply dropped dead. No warning, no sound that the microphones picked up. One moment, a Kronak soldier was standing, his weapon casually held across his chest, and the next moment he collapsed straight down as if someone had cut his strings. He didn't stagger or clutch at a wound. He just fell instantly and completely, like a puppet whose operator had walked away. The other soldiers in the frame stared at their fallen comrade in obvious confusion. They looked around, searching for a threat, an explanation. The captive humans looked just as confused, though some of them were beginning to show signs of hope, dangerous and desperate. The confusion lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then, the death began in earnest. Soldiers started dropping all across the fields. 5 fell in the first seconds, then 10, then 20. It wasn't random, there was a pattern to it, a wave moving across the field like wind through wheat. But this wind harvested lives instead of grain. The camera operator, either through incredible presence of mind or automated systems, zoomed in on one section of the field. The detail it captured was horrifying in its clarity. Something that looked like rain was falling, tiny objects so small they were almost invisible individually, created a shimmer in the air like heat distortion. Where they touched the ground, they made little holes, perfect circles no bigger than a pencil eraser. The green ground was becoming perforated, dotted with hundreds, then thousands of these tiny impacts. But the grass wasn't the target. Everywhere the rain fell, Kronak soldiers dropped. The tiny projectiles, whatever they were punching through their scaled armor as if it were paper. Entry wounds appeared on shoulders, heads, backs, chests. The wounds were small, precise, but clearly catastrophic. Soldiers fell in mid-stride, mid-turn, mid-word, and impossibly, horrifyingly, miraculously, not a single human was hit. The human captives were running now, scrambling to their feet, fleeing from their dead or dying captors. They ran in every direction, panicked and confused, not understanding what was happening, but knowing that their opportunity for survival was measured in seconds. They ran right through the falling rain of death, and it parted around them like water around stones. One human woman ran directly through where 3 Kronak soldiers had just fallen. The same deadly rain that had killed them in seconds passed inches from her body and hit nothing. A young man stumbled and fell, crawling on his hands and knees, and the projectiles that must have been falling all around him somehow all missed, finding only the Kronak soldiers who had been reaching for him. The camera pulled back, showing the full scope of what was happening. The entire field was becoming a graveyard. Hundreds of Kronak soldiers were down now, their green and black scaled bodies forming pools of blood that spread across the grass like oil slicks. The survivors were trying to return fire, shooting blindly at the sky, but their weapons found no targets. There was nothing to hit. Nothing to fight back against. The human captives continued to flee, running toward the edge of the field, toward cover, toward anywhere that might offer protection from the horror unfolding around them, and still, not one of them was hit. The deadly rain that fell from the sky distinguished perfectly between Kronak and human, finding only the former and sparing absolutely the latter. In the dome of Tertius I, the venue had become chaos. The Kronak delegation was screaming, their voices creating a cacophony of rage and terror and disbelief. They shouted questions at the human delegation, at Anor, at their own technical team on the ground. Some of them were trying to access their own communication devices, presumably attempting to contact their military or their government, trying to understand what was happening to their people on that distant moon. The crowd in the observation galleries had joined the noise. Every species was reacting according to their nature. Questions flew through the air in dozens of languages.
What are we seeing?
Is this real or some kind of simulation? Why are only the Kronak dying?
What technology could do this?
Through it all, the human delegation remained silent. They stood in their rigid formation, weathering the storm of questions and accusations with the same indifference they had shown to the images of their own people suffering. If anything, they seemed more relaxed now, as if some tension had been released. The noise continued for minutes, growing louder, more chaotic. It was Anor who finally managed to cut through it, their voice amplified to override all others, the translation systems giving their words priority.
Silence!
The word echoed through the dome, and remarkably, beings from hundreds of species actually obeyed. The noise died down to whispers, then to silence, though it was a silence that filled with tension and suppressed panic. Anor's tentacles were moving up and down. Even without seeing the Botyr's full face, everyone could sense the mediator's distress.
I must ask,
Anor began, his voice strained.
On behalf of all species present, on behalf of the Galactic Federation itself, what has just happened? What did we witness? What did you do?
The question was directed at the human delegation, but particularly at the blonde woman who stood at the front of the platform. her hand still resting casually on her earpiece. She looked at Anor for a moment, seemed to consider, then turned to the microphone drone that had remained in position throughout everything. When she spoke, her voice was clear and professional, the tone of someone delivering a briefing rather than explaining an act of mass killing. "My name is Ivy Perrin," she began. "I am an operative who usually works as a liaison between the many weapons conglomerates on Earth and the various human governments. I coordinate research and development programs, facilitate technology transfers, ensure that our military-industrial complex remains cutting-edge and highly competitive." She paused, making sure everyone was paying attention. They were. Every sensory organ in the dome was focused on her. "I was summoned here not as an ambassador, not as a diplomat, and certainly not as a translator, despite what many of you assumed. I was brought here to sell a solution to a problem, and as you've just witnessed, I'm very good at my job." On the screen behind her, the last few Kronak soldiers were falling. The field was a nightmare landscape now, covered with bodies and blood. The human captives had largely fled to the edges of the frame or disappeared entirely, running for their lives into whatever cover the moon's landscape offered. "What you saw," Ivy continued, her voice taking on a lecturer's cadence, "was the deployment of the smart flechette system, a new implementation of an old design. The concept of flechettes, for those unfamiliar with human military history, dates back centuries. Tiny dart-like projectiles dropped from aircraft or artillery, capable of penetrating armor due to their shape and velocity." She gestured vaguely at the screen. "We've modernized the concept considerably. Each unit is manufactured for a fraction of $1, quite literally. We can produce millions of them for less than the cost of a single traditional missile. They're small enough that most radar systems won't detect them, or will dismiss them as debris or atmospheric interference. We deploy them from orbit using canisters that look like communication satellites, or supply pods." The technical explanation was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone discussing a mundane product rather than a horrifying weapon. "As they fall, they form a distributed network. Each flechette has a disposable AI, nothing sophisticated. Nothing that violates our own limitations on autonomous weapons, just enough processing power to identify targets, communicate with its neighbors, and make one simple decision. And in this case, the AI had a very easy job. It just had to distinguish between human and non-human." The words hung in the air like poison gas. "The targeting perimeters can be adjusted, of course," Ivy continued. "Human versus non-human was the setting for this deployment, but we can make it much more specific. Kronak versus everyone else, civilian versus combatants, males versus females, adults versus children. The AI can process any parameter we program into it, and it does so with near perfect accuracy, as you've witnessed." Silence, the kind of silence that exists in the moments after something irreversible has occurred, when everyone is trying to process what they've learned and what it means for the future. "The smart flechette system has been in development for decades," Ivy explained. "We couldn't use it on Earth. Too many treaties, too many ethical considerations, too many laws about autonomous weapons and indiscriminate force. But the Kronak have done us a tremendous favor." For the first time, something like emotion entered her voice. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of bitter acceptance. "Earth's various governments have officially determined that the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, the United Nations restrictions on weapons of mass destruction, and every other humanitarian law we've developed over centuries, none of them apply to non-humans. We're not bound by our own ethical limitations when dealing with species outside our planet." The implication hit like a shockwave. "So all those creative weapon systems we've developed over the past centuries, all the designs that were too inhumane to use, too indiscriminate to deploy, too horrifying to seriously consider, they're all fair game now. The Kronak have shown us that we're in a real war, not a diplomatic disagreement. And in real war, you use every advantage you have." Ivy's voice dropped, becoming quieter but somehow more intense.
I personally don't like how things turned out. I'm not an enjoyer of violence, despite my profession. I would have preferred a diplomatic solution, a genuine peace treaty, an arrangement where both our species could coexist without resorting to weapons that make even their designers uncomfortable.
She looked directly at Bryozip, who was still frozen in shock on his platform.
But thanks to the Kronak, thanks to their brilliant decision to attack a civilian colony, to take hostages, to broadcast their atrocities to the entire galaxy as a show of dominance, well, now a lot of CEOs of weapons companies are very happy. They have a proving ground, they have permission, and they have enemies who've demonstrated they deserve everything we can throw at them.
The silence that fell over the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of shock or confusion. It was the silence of terrible understanding, of species across the galaxy realizing that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power. Ivy Perrin stepped back from the microphone drone, her part complete. As she moved away, the usual human ambassador, a distinguished man with gray hair and the kind of face that belonged on diplomatic credentials, stepped forward. His nameplate identified him as Ambassador Richard, Earth's senior representative to the Galactic Federation. He looked across at the Kronak delegation with a smile that somehow managed to be both polite and absolutely terrifying. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of Ivy's technical coldness. He sounded friendly, almost jovial, like someone greeting old friends.
"So, gentlemen,"
Richard said, his smile widening,
"how about we talk peace now?"
He let the word hang in the air, demonstrations. As if what they'd just witnessed was merely a product showcase rather than the death of hundreds of Kronak soldiers. Bryozip opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Around him, the other Kronak delegates stood in similar paralysis, their entire worldview having been shattered in the space of minutes. The negotiations that followed would take weeks. The terms that eventually emerged would be far more favorable to humanity than anyone had predicted. The Kronak military would withdraw completely. More importantly, they would agree to a treaty that established clear boundaries and rules for interaction between their species and humanity. But beyond the specific terms, something larger had changed. The Galactic Federation, which had existed in a state of periodic conflict and uneasy truces for millennia, entered what historians would later call the first century of peace. The smart flechette system, and the implied threat of even more horrifying weapons in humanity's arsenal, created a deterrent that no amount of diplomacy had ever achieved. Species that had been enemies for generations suddenly found that their conflict seemed less important when compared to the possibility of drawing humanity's military attention. Border disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than force. Resources were shared rather than fought over. The galaxy didn't become a utopia, nothing so dramatic, but it became significantly more peaceful. And through it all, in the archives of 1,000 species, the recording of that day on Tertius 1 remained available. A reminder of what could happen when diplomacy failed, when one species pushed too far, when the Translator turned out to be something far more dangerous. Ivy Perrin returned to Earth and continued her work coordinating military research programs. She gave interviews occasionally, always downplaying her role, always emphasizing that she'd just been doing her job. The smart flechette system was never deployed again. The threat of its existence proved sufficient. In the Kronak Empire, Bryozip's career ended in disgrace. He became a cautionary tale, the ambassador who had been so confident in his species' superiority that he'd provoked a demonstration of humanity's true capabilities. Kronak military doctrine was completely revised, with new emphasis placed on understanding potential enemies before engaging them. And across the galaxy, in 100 different languages and communication formats, one phrase entered common usage. When someone was being too aggressive, too confident, too sure that their superior position gave them immunity from consequence, others would say, "Careful, or you'll meet your translator." It meant the person you're underestimating might be the most dangerous one in the room. It meant assumptions can be fatal. It meant sometimes the person standing quietly in the back is the one you should fear most. The lesson was learned, peace held, and humanity's position in the Galactic Federation would take a very long time to be seriously challenged again.